Hello, I'm James Ivers, the lead of the SEI's Software Architecture Group. It's my pleasure to introduce the 2021 winner of the Linda M. Northrop Software Architecture Award, Rolf Seegers. The SEI started its work in software architecture in the early 90s, and it has been a focus of ours ever since. We've created methods and practices for architects, used them across government and industry organizations, and shared these insights through seminal books, papers, and courses because we know what kind of difference architects can make. Linda Northrop founded this work at the SEI, and we created this award to recognize others who have used software architecture to significantly improve practices and outcomes within their organizations or within the broader architecture community. I can confidently say that Rolf has done all of the above, and I'm delighted to recognize him as this year's winner. In Rolf's talk, he will share his insights into and reflections on establishing an enduring architecture practice across a global enterprise. The work he has led for over 20 years has fostered the success of more than 1,000 architects and is a remarkable accomplishment. We've reserved time for questions after his talk, so please feel free to suggest questions in the chat and enjoy the talk.
Hey there, everyone. I'm honored to receive this award. I have to say it's a little bit intimidating based on the enormous contributions that Linda Northrop has made to the software architecture discipline and especially the field of product lines. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk with you today about some of Raytheon's experiences in establishing and evolving an architecture expertise across the company. Most of what I'll present today is within what I'll call legacy Raytheon. So before our merger last year with United Technologies, but all of these initiatives are still in place. And since the merger, they've just been expanding across the new company, Raytheon Technologies. So I want to start with a chart coming up showing where we are right now, and then I'll kind of regress back in time and walk us up again to our current state. Touching on what the initial drivers were for a lot of these architecture-related initiatives that we've got inside the company, what we're trying to achieve, and again, then the key elements of how we got there. When I was thinking about today's talk, something struck me that I had read recently. That was a quote from Vincent van Gogh when he was writing a letter to his brother, and it turns out it was within a few days of right now, 139 years ago. And he said, "Great things do not happen by impulse. They are the succession of small things linked together." And I think that's a very good example of a quest like this, to build an expertise, a competence, really in anything across your organization. It typically takes a variety of very small things growing over time, and then the assemblage of those, of course, can turn into something very, very significant. So I'll offer some of our lessons learned and then talk about the foundation, which you see from the chart here. The process is where everything really baselined for us. And then over those years since the process definition and its ongoing evolution, what else we launched for architecture competence and growth, and what I consider to be the key factors on helping this promulgate over the years. So first, our current state. The graphic you see here is our Mission Architecture Program's key elements. So this is essentially a program of company-wide initiatives. And these initiatives span architecture process, the reuse assets of architecture, reference architectures, and related to those product line architectures, of course, our Certified Architect program, and then a companion and more specific Software Architect program we spun off of the CAP after several years. And as you see at the bottom there, collaborations, very important inside your organization and outside your organization, how you share your knowledge and how you gain knowledge from others. And of course, you need a governance structure for any major activities. So when there are changes to the process or changes to the training programs or the certification programs, you'll want a body of people who, of course, make those decisions that span all the businesses or all the subunits of your organization. So that's where we are, right? We have this global architecture competence program, but it's taken 20-ish years to get here. So looking back to the early 2000s and late 1990s, many of you are probably aware, in particular in the 90s, right? Architecture as a discipline in our context was beginning to emerge. That's when the Garland Shaw book came out. That's when white papers and journal articles were beginning to emerge about software architecture and system architecture and enterprise architecture. The US government had a number of mandates and directives and memorandums and policies coming out. The first Gulf War highlighted significant need for more interoperability between systems and the standards, of course, that a lot of us use to this day were beginning to emerge in that time frame. So that was what was going on outside our organization. And then inside, again, late 1990s into the early 2000s, of course, we were large, very large then, and we're even larger now since our merger last year with United Technologies. So trying to institutionalize any expertise is a challenge in larger organizations, of course. So size was one challenge. On top of that, we had a lot of people who were performing in this role of architect, but at varying levels of rigor and their own background, mainly being their guide to the design process. So you have business cards and email signatures and other areas where now this word architect is appearing, this moniker attached to an awful lot of people, right? But you really don't have a common baseline of knowledge for people that are now self-proclaiming architect, right, as their role. And they haven't all been through any standard or common training, and there's no governance authority that would have established that common training. And then there's also no way for them to share their own best practices, heuristics, techniques with one another, or the templates and reuse assets, the engineering directives they may write, the models they create for potential reuse, et cetera. There was no mechanism for that in place. So we had challenges, again, internally and externally. So looking ahead at that point in time, it was clear to leadership we needed to establish and grow an expertise in software architecture, system architecture at the outset, and not too far behind came the realization we also needed to get into the enterprise architecture realm. So this global expertise was for a variety of things, right? Ultimately, by using architecture, as we all do, to manage complexity and to manage risk in our system design, that makes for better products, systems, services, which then, of course, in turn benefits your customer and what they're trying to achieve, the capabilities they need, and helps them achieve their successes. By standardizing your approaches, you enable reuse, right? By, of course, focusing on standards also, you've got an opportunity for compliance with directives and mandates. And also setting up these programs, in particular our software architect program and our certified architect program, you identify your expertise throughout your workforce, because each of your organizations, your business units, your product lines, your mission areas are each year or twice a year, they're having to look at their workforce and identify the key people performing these duties that they want to put into these programs. So over time, now you essentially understand your intellectual assets in the architecture space more so than you might have before setting up programs like this. And then, of course, you'll want a mechanism when you establish this community of architects, whether it's in one nation or around the world or at one site, you still want them to share and interact with each other. So they need a way to communicate and collaborate. And part of their charge going forward should be to give back, right? Part of that is mentoring the next generation. Another aspect of that is looking outside your company to help evolve the practice of architecture. Now, when any organization is trying to establish expertise, they typically look at this three-legged stool, if you will, that this slide represents, right? People, process, technology. I prefer to use the term enablers for that last stovepipe. simply because some people hear technology and they become very focused on it's got to be high-end monitors to see these grandiose architecture design models, or it's got to be a high-capacity performing laptop because I need more bandwidth because of the complexity and the magnitude of my design on this large-scale system. And that's a piece of it, right? But enablers, I feel, is a broader term that also then gets you thinking, okay, I just need to think of what will allow my architects to architect better. And that then gets you thinking about reuse in particular, right? So the technology is important, but establishing product line architectures and reference architectures and templates for an architecture description document, an architecture plan or contract, if you use that terminology. Different examples of architecture principles, perhaps, that different engagements in your organization have been a part of. There are many things you can templatize, right? And so all those things together would go into that third stovepipe there of enablers. And of course, across all of these, you want some sort of governance structure so that when it's required, you have decision makers in place to make changes to process or to people's learning programs, et cetera. So if I take this triad now and contrast it to what we saw a moment ago of the Raytheon program of programs, the Mission Architecture Program and all its key elements, you'll see the way that those two map together are for the people column. That, of course, ties into our Certified Architect Program and our Software Architect Development Program. And there's a difference there because the Certified Architect Program is focused on system and enterprise architects. And then the Software Architect Program is obviously focused on software architects. Now, that being said, there are large areas in our company where the software essentially is the system. So we also have many senior software people in the certification program. And there's an overlap, as you might suspect, of the training. So there are unique classes across both those programs, and there are common classes across both those programs. We have a variety of interest groups. Think of them as communities of practice, communities of interest. You might use a different term. We call them technology interest groups. And so we have a variety of those across the company tied to architecture. So the people in these programs would be tied into those interest groups, but not just the senior practitioners across the company. The interest groups any employee can join. So you've got a continuum of expertise in our architecture-related groups for system architecture, enterprise architecture, software architecture, product lines, business architecture, open architecture, the list goes on and on. The process, we established many years ago, and I've got a chart coming up to flesh it out a little bit, but a process that is a tool for our software architects, our system architects, and our enterprise architects to guide them through the architecture thinking and then capturing those decisions through models. And then enablers I've already touched on here, just some examples of those. So for our particular journey, everything started with the process. And this was, it went company-wide circa 2002, as you see on the slide here. Its roots go back into the late 1990s, but that was within one pocket of the company. 2002 is when it was first established as company-wide. And the scope, as you would for any process, you're saying, okay, well, which part of the engineering life cycle are we going to be bounded by? And so it's noted here, it's from the very beginning, understanding the context, right? The enterprise within which the system will be designed, and perhaps even the enterprise within the enterprise, looking at your different customer communities. Our focus from the outset was system architecture, but we look to the software architecture and enterprise architecture communities. And as this process has evolved over time, it as I just noted, it is a tool, an enabler now for all three of these major architecture realms inside our company. We did not roll our own process. We looked towards, even here in the turn of the millennium, we looked towards the standards communities. We did not find a perfect fit in any particular architecture-related standard at that time, nor have we, revisiting this over time, ever found a perfect standard fit. But they all bring something very important to the architect's table. And so what we determined to do at the outset was create a very thin wrapper around standards, right? Just that shows how we would connect the dots. And then that way we're really leveraging what the standard brings to the table. And then we're, again, bringing them together, because in many cases, these individual standards were not created to coexist with one another, but we found that they can be unified. It's not on this chart, but I should note, because, well, back to Van Gogh, right? Very small things assembled create something great. So the first incarnation of this process was only two standards. It was the C4ISR architecture framework, which is the predecessor to the DODAF, the first bullet here. And it was the SEI's ATAM, the architecture assessment technique, if you will. And so starting small and then growing over time. So this process foundation was really, really important, right? To know what we would practice in a common approach to the architecting thinking. And that was then what we could build a training program on top of, and then a certification program to assess the credentials of the people who were architecting, right? Who have gone through those programs. I will note from this chart here also that these frameworks, even though many of these have the word framework in them, they're not the same thing, right? Conceptually, or their constructs are different. So for those who are unfamiliar with it, the Department of Defense Architecture Framework is a list of architecture models. And then underneath it, a meta model that shows like the common piece parts across models. So if you're unfamiliar with the DODAF, I would encourage you in any domain out there to please go look at those models, because while the DoD assembled this in its formal structure, these are not military architecture models. These are models that have been around, many of them, for decades, right? So if you build context diagrams and data models and event trace or sequence diagrams and n-squared diagrams and activity models, et cetera, those are what you will see described here in the DODAF. That particular standard does not tell you how to architect, right? It's not a methodology. It's just a model pick list. The Open Group Framework, on the other hand, is primarily, and has been for many, many years, all about their ADM, their architecture development methodology. So here, from the sound bites I've just provided, you're given food for thought. Well, if there's one framework that's all about method and another framework that's all about documenting your architecture, maybe there's a synergy there, okay? And then the Zachman Framework for Enterprise Architecture we find to be an excellent thinking tool, especially in the infancy of architecture brainstorming, when the team is together and the whiteboard is empty or the 3M tablets are clean, and you just need some way to facilitate your thinking through the primitives of the architecture, which eventually then decisions will be made, and you will capture those in composite models via the DODAF models typically. And then once you have an architecture, of course, you need to check the goodness of it. And that's where the SEI's technique is invaluable. I haven't touched on the FIAF, so I'll give a tip of the hat to them also. So the US government, over a set of years since late 1990s, has published several documents, one being the framework proper, which had important concepts of an as-is and a to-be architecture. And then that stack of architecture views you see in many cases, right? The data architecture, the application architecture, the business or mission architecture, and technology or solution architecture. So those terms have been around in many different standards for many, many years. They even predate the 1999 FIAF and go back into the 1980s, some work out of NIST. So I spent a lot of time on this chart. It's very important because, again, process is the foundation of everything that our company did since then. So a few lessons learned from those early years establishing our foundation process, which I should also note New releases have come out over the years. The next publication of the REAP process will be out in the fourth quarter. So this is an ongoing evolution, right? You don't create it and then it stays pat for decades, right? You have to continuously keep it aligned as the building blocks or the standards change, or as your own understanding of the architecture practice changes, and you want to roll in your own organization's thinking. So no surprise here, right? User standards reduces cost. So you don't have to come up with your own set of dozens of models and the meta model interconnecting the core elements of those models. You can simply get online, go to the US government site, pull down the DODAF, right? And there are many other architecture frameworks for description. So I'll note that if you're familiar with the Defense Architecture Framework, the DAF out of Australia, or the NATO Architecture Framework, or Canadians' DINDAF, the defense framework there, or more recently, the Unified Architecture Framework out of the Object Management Group. All of those frameworks and others baselined off of the DODAF, right? That was the foundation for many other regions frameworks or bodies frameworks. So using standards will save you a lot of money, okay? I've already noted the term framework is somewhat overloaded, and in many cases, based on the frameworks you're looking at, they are addressing a completely different aspect of the architecting process or the architect's needs. There's a Venn diagram. So while we started our journey focused on system and software architecture, as I noted earlier, it didn't take us long to realize enterprise architecture, the concepts, the constructs, the techniques from that arena would be beneficial to us, right? So there is this overlap of useful things to all three: software architect, system architect, enterprise architect, and there are elements that are unique in those three areas. So I would just encourage you, if you're in particular focused on software architecture and have not looked at the literature, whether that's a standard or journal articles or conference presentations from the software and enterprise communities, I would encourage you to please add those to your learning. Iteration, okay, nothing's going to be perfect. It's going to be far, far from it when you first deploy, whether it's with a process or a training program or create a reference architecture, etc. You just have to brace yourself for constructive critique, and again, then just take that and improve. And this last one here was a bit of a surprise, as I lived it many years ago. But when the process foundation was first set in 2002, one of the engineering vice presidents from one of our business units contacted me, and he said, "I want to fly you to every one of my sites over the next 2 to 3 months. And I want you to do in-person sessions of varying durations about this at that time, about this new process," right? And we were already communicating it across all the business units, but as you might guess at that time, a lot of that was through Skype or telecons, et cetera, right? But he said, "I want you in the room talking to people face to face." And so we came up with 3 different tiers of orientation, right? 30-minute overviews for executives, 2-hour overviews for next level down, just to make them a little bit more conversational in the process, if you will. And then 1.5-day sessions that allowed for a little more immersion and some hands-on, getting down into all the sub-processes and flowing through all the activities of our Raytheon process. And those trips were extremely successful. So we were quite pleased having done it. It gave us a new perspective on how important FaceTime still is, right? And this was a long time ago. We continue to try and stay focused on this when the opportunity presents itself. The pandemic obviously changed everything, but we are always looking for opportunities to be with people, right? As opposed to just virtually doing everything. So since that process foundation, you can look at this as a checklist, a roadmap, call it what you will. But from that starting point in the early 2000s, we, through the beginning of those first two interactions, right? So the ATAM and the C4ISR framework, since renamed to the DoD architecture framework, we started working with the orgs behind those, the SEI for ATAM and of course the DODAF or the CAF working group out of the government at that time, and then started looking towards other consortia and standards organizations. And so the open group emerged and the TOGAF was added into our mix. And then the ZACMAN framework emerged. And so then we started working with ZACMAN International, and the list went on and on, grows on, and it still continues to grow. So while the standard was set up and we started these interactions, then we realized about a year later, we're probably going to need some sort of overarching governance structure. So senior architects from across all the business units were identified by the engineering vice presidents to come together and form Raytheon's corporate architecture board. So I'm on this board, and there are give or take usually around 20 senior architects, again spanning the business units. After that, corporate engineering and technology asked us to launch a certification program for architects, right? And so unlike a certificate, certification requires some sort of assessment of your credentials, right? And you can do that through a written test, you can do that through orals, there's many different mechanisms. In our particular case, candidates submit a package of their credentials. There are over 50 requirements to achieve the Raytheon certification. And then they have a series of orals boards that they go through with board members assessing and discussing with them their background and experience against all the requirements. And then 100% compliance is required in order to achieve certification. So it's not just a passing grade. It's very binary, right? You either meet all criteria or you're not certified. Serious effort. I mean, small reuse architectures were being built earlier than this, but the big bang focus with significant dollars behind it started in 2005 and continued beyond in large domain-specific reference architectures being built across the company, and of course product line architectures. And to distinguish between the two product lines, you might, as the name implies, right, think of in our context. That would be an effector, a sensor, something along those lines. Reference architectures are just the large domains in which we tend to design large-scale systems, right? So that's the assemblage of many, many products and people and software and et cetera, right, in those reference architectures. So giving our architects a common baseline, again, in the areas that we tend to design a lot of systems in over the decades. This next one looks a little odd, right? Because I presented this graphic at the outset where we are, but it's important for me to note that our initiatives were, I'll say, a la carte prior to this emergence of RayMap. So we had an ongoing process initiative, and it was evolving over time. We had a certified architect program established with a training program within it for architects, and it would evolve, right? And we set up the governance structure, et cetera. But these were all independently funded, even though they were focused across the company, right? It was different colors of money. And what it was determined through corporate leadership is we need an overarching umbrella program, if you will, for common governance, common management, common funds to continue to evolve and ensure there is harmonization across all these company-wide architecture initiatives. And so that brought us the Mission Architecture Program, which is that wrapper of all these other architecture initiatives. The color-coded here is just to highlight that we have a couple of aspects that were given to us, credentials given to us outside of our company. So the Open Group Consortia started a process in the late 2000s where they assess architect programs, certification programs. And so you can get online and find the documented criteria that your program must comply with to be compliant and to achieve their accreditation. So our certified architect program was put through that review. It took a number of months, It requires re-accreditation every 2 to 3 years. And so we have maintained our accreditation to this day. And so we appreciated the opportunity because, of course, we felt our program was rigorous. It's nice to have someone, another organization, perform an independent assessment and proclaim the same. And then as a part of that process, it was a requirement that your architects use a recognized method, which is a different assessment that they also can perform for organizations. So we submitted our architecture process into that review and achieved, as noted here, recognized method for architecture. So you can go to the Open Group site. You will see approximately 36 recognized methods. Most of them, like the REAP, are internal to a company, but you'll see the Rational Unified Process, the TOGAF Architecture Development Method. There are also some industry methods out there. So if your organization does not have your own architecture approach, you might look at that list there and see what's accessible to the world at large that you might consider, which has already, again, been assessed and proclaimed a recognized method. So a few years after our Certified Architect program was launched and of course, iterated and improved, Corporate Engineering and Technology asked that we look at launching a software architecture specific, specialty program. And so that's been done. And both those programs run to this day. Actually, here in the fourth quarter, we're launching 2 new cohorts in each of those programs. So they're still very, very successful, very important, and we always have a lot of interest in them. So the Software Architect Program, again, was spun off. And then, as I noted earlier, we've got the latest version of our architecture process, which continues to evolve over time, coming out soon. So the last thing I want to note today is what helped, right? Because while I've given you at a high level key initiatives you might think about for your organization to build an expertise in the architecture practice, one person, one group does not go it alone, right? So for us, it started with executive champions, right? Coming from corporate engineering and technology from the outset, right? The first Raytheon event, I was telling someone this recently, the first company-wide Raytheon event in architecture was actually called by the CTO in the early 2000s, right? With people from government, someone from the SEI came in as a guest speaker, key Raytheon architects at that point in time, and just beginning to establish what was going to be the way forward as the company added architecture to our portfolio of our skills, right, and our expertise. And of course, having that corporate advocacy is really, really important. Okay. On top of that, we have enjoyed, the architecture initiatives. We've enjoyed advocates, both grassroots, the engineering community across the company, and those business leaders, not corporate, right, but within inside the business units, those engineering vice presidents, those program managers, who also understand the importance of this and how this makes us better and build better products, systems, services. So that's been a huge benefit, right? I'm going to skip a bullet quickly here and also say funding, right? So this is not expensive, but you don't have to pay for it all at once either. Again, small things over time, and then they grow. So money from corporate engineering and technology, money from the business units, money from even the training and development, workforce development budgets for the architecture instruction for all the architects we have. There's over 1,000 architects across the company who have been through our training program. The propagation of the REAP process, which has been on well over 1,000 engagements, large to small, variety of customer communities, U.S. and abroad. It's just amazing the breadth that the REAP has provided value. Again, no matter the context for the architecture effort. And then continuity of leadership. So I've been blessed that I've been permitted, honored to lead many of our architecture initiatives. I led the REAP initiative from its outset. I've co-led our certified architect program since it was first formed. I'm the leader of the RayMap initiative, and I have many colleagues on the corporate architecture board who also have been leaders in our company of establishing and institutionalizing a variety of architecture practices, right? Whether it's mission architecture techniques or evaluation architecture techniques or anything in between. We were very focused also from the beginning about making sure we were internationally friendly, right? We had a global workforce. We wanted to make sure in our training programs or other aspects, the process that we were creating, that we didn't create anything that was going to be restricted to U.S. Citizens only, and only have that portion of our workforce able to leverage it. So there are obviously some things, in particular in reuse architectures, that are restricted by nation. But where we can, we've been very deliberate in trying to make it all internationally accessible across our workforce. And you've got the list here, which also in different terms shows up on our RayMap graphic. The key elements for establishing, institutionalizing, and continuing to maintain our architecture expertise, right? Common process. And part of what comes with that is terminology, right? Enabling us to use the same architecture language. So when you say view and I say viewpoint, we both understand we're talking about different things, right? Or architecture versus architecture description. It's not in this core of the chart deck, but I should give a tip of the hat to ISO 42010. If you're not familiar with that architecture standard, I encourage you to go look at it. That has, over the years, essentially become the data dictionary for software system, and in its next release, enterprise architects. So what that term view means versus viewpoint, architecture versus architecture description, architecture framework, etc. If you're looking in your organization to standardize on the language of architects, you could do very well to look towards 4210. Some sort of governance structure, right? Probably don't want an army of one, but ideally some assemblage of your senior architects across whatever your sub organizations are within your company or enterprise. Training program, which ideally, of course, ties directly to your process. And maybe, if it's important to you, understanding the competence, the skills, the credentials of your architects. It's one thing to send people through very rigorous training programs. It's another thing to, of course, ensure that they can practice what they've learned after the fact, right? And that is a multi-year journey in many people's cases. Reuse. You need to look at product line architectures and perhaps on a larger scale reference architectures, and of course templates. And your organization probably has a lot of template fodder right now. You can go to existing systems and the artifacts that you already have, and then just try and generalize those, right? I mean, architecture is all about abstraction, so it shouldn't be hard for you to templatize something, even if it wasn't created to be a template. And then please give some thought to how, when you have established an architecture community, how they can get together and share their expertise with one another. At some point in your own journey, it becomes important to do some sort of assessment. Okay, we all feel inside that much good comes from establishing this expertise, and again, this allows us to manage risk, manage complexity in our system designs, right? So that's also a key aspect of it. And it's certainly not easy to figure out what to measure, but I would just challenge you to figure out what to measure, because it's important, once established and given time to grow, that then you take time to look across your deployments and say, okay, how can I determine the value impact, the value proposition, if you will, of the architecture practice, of the architects across my organization. So that requires data, and I would say probably years of data that you have to assemble. So be mindful of that, start gathering that so that at some point when it's appropriate, you have everything in place to where now you can perform the more rigorous analyses to establish that value. And the last bullet is probably really stating the obvious here, right? But all of this takes time. So you need to let it go and let it grow and iterate. Okay, don't be afraid to change, but don't change perpetually, right? Let things happen, and then look back, talk with your colleagues, talk with those who've lived through it, talk with those outside who offer their own keen perspective on it, and iterate. And with that, I finished the course section of my charts. I want to let you know there are some supplemental slides I put in after the main chart deck here. So if you've got an opportunity and want a little bit more information on the process or the certification program, or even just a simple list of a lot of our collaborative partners outside our company who we've looked to in academia and consortia, government agencies, et cetera, I've got a list there for you of most of them. So thank you again to the SEI for this incredible honor. My contact information is here, so if anyone has any questions for me, I'm happy to follow up with you in email. If you can't reach me, then please be patient. And thanks again.
Thanks, Rolf. Thanks, Rolf. Really appreciate taking the time to deliver that talk to us. I think there's a lot for all of us to learn. As a reminder to everyone who's watching live, we are open for questions in chat. We'll see how many we can get through today. And to start things off, Rolf, I'd like to ask you about your aha moments, how you got on this path. I mean, clearly you would not have started this journey if you didn't believe in the value that architecture provides. Do you recall some kind of aha moment when you decided that this was something you needed to do for yourself and your organization? And did you imagine it would go this far?
Well, I did not imagine to this level, James, but again, this is kind of looking back 20 years now. Aha moments. So I'll say we started in the late 90s, and really the initial quest dealt with the transition, the handoff between system engineering and software engineering, and trying to improve and streamline that part of the engineering process, if you will. And as we were researching ways to get better at that, we, and again, think about the late 90s, right? There was architecture literature starting to emerge. And we came across, actually, probably some of your colleagues, we came across David Garland and Mary Shaw's book on software architecture, and also different journal articles and other things that gave us some insight into that world, right? Which was just then emerging. And so we thought, so maybe this architecture thing is a way forward. And we started then directing our team and our research efforts in that world. And you know, it all started, as I was talking earlier, about the process, right? And while the process has a lot of standards unified in it now, in the beginning, it all started with the C4ISR framework and the ATAM out of the SEI, right? So we had a way to model, capture our design decisions, model the architecture, and evaluate the architecture. And then the years go by, and within those first couple of years after that two standard baseline, if you will, there was an aha moment. I remember, because I've still got a airplane napkin in my office where I was on an American Airlines flight, and this is 2003, 2004, and I'm looking at the open group architecture framework at that time, which some of you know is a lot focused on methodology, right? The architect practice. And then the C4ISR framework, which was the models. And I was doodling how the crop circles is what the open group calls them, but the phases of their architecting activities might relate to specific models being developed within those phases. And I was very early on already the architecture geek, I'll say, James, because I remember trembling. I was so excited, right? Thinking, so I'll call that an aha moment, right? Thinking about the opportunity to bring those two disparate standards together, right? They weren't created to coexist, but we thought maybe there's something there. You're resurrecting some thoughts from the past, James.
Well, it's a good time to reflect. So we have one question from the audience, and I understand that we're in an open forum here. You can't get too specific, but Scott was wondering about some of the biggest wins that architecture has had. And so perhaps you could talk a little bit about what kinds of things you consider success, and things that are easier or harder to look at and share with management to foster the support that you've created.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that word win, right? You can just interpret so many different ways. In our defense contractor community, obviously you're thinking, okay, I'm responding to an RFP. Did I win the program or not? But there are other aspects, right? Maybe you're already on the program and you're using architecture, simply as your way forward, right? For structured design and such. So I will just say, Scott, we've seen wins in a variety of aspects, right? We've seen, of course, the more traditional program wins that I just mentioned, but also very, very significant wins in let me call them reuse architectures. Okay, so your company is putting money into development of a product line architecture or a perhaps larger scale reference architecture in a domain where you commonly design systems. And, for a lot of companies, I think it's fair to say they'll look at a dollar ROI, right? They'll say, okay, I spent this much money developing this reuse architecture, whatever its label might be. And now I've reused it this number of times and saved this many man hours or person hours. And so, how does that balance against the investment? Oh, okay, I'm in the positive. So that's a win. I will just say in our reuse architectures, we've seen much greater lift than I think anybody would have predicted. Part of that is because of the architect community or infrastructure we have in place globally. It's much easier to propagate these reuse architectures to the experts who can leverage them, right? Part one is building it, of course, but then how many people can you provide access to it? And I mean, there are some restrictions. Some of these are US based or some other nation based, so they can't be shared across the globe. But even within your nation, then, if you've got that community of architects built up, you can still get, again, a lot of reuse, which again is another aspect of a win. And I'll touch on one third one, and then James, I'll let you go to another question. But I will also say, it's important to keep the workforce happy, and it's been that way over 2 decades that we've been architecting, right? And this discipline, right, the architecture practice, whether it be software architecture, system architecture, enterprise architecture, is a means where technical people, senior technical people, can stay technical, right? They still have an upper end career path, right? That they can strive for, and when they're there, if they choose to, simply maintain. And part of that job satisfaction then is a win in keeping your most skilled employees at your organization, right? Not being tempted away by competitors or other career paths, et cetera. So different ways to turn on win there, James. Very good question. Thanks, Scott.
Okay. So somewhat related to that, I'm sure you've had experiences like I've had where, architecture is going to help an organization, a team, but there's a little bit of resistance. Maybe a team hasn't used architecture before, or maybe they're worried it's going to cost too much to do. What are some of the arguments you found to be persuasive to help persuade the reluctant to try architecture and to get the kind of value that you've seen?
Yeah, 2 things jump to my mind, James. One is research that was done by, so it was a joint MIT-USC collaboration, and they looked at software-intensive systems, so that type of system should resonate with this audience. Varying sizes, right? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of lines of code, various domains, right? So you had a command and control, real-time embedded systems to insurance or airline or oil and gas, just various industries, batch processing to real time, right? So multiple perspectives of this pool of 150 plus programs that they analyzed. And I feel it's probably safe to say that all of us in our gut, in our heart, would say it's really important to spend time up front in design. And the more solid that design is, the less pain you will suffer later in the life cycle, right? We all know that. Well, what the MIT USC research did, James, was show it with data, right? So you can, if you're interested in it, you could Google. A portion of the paper's title is "Using Risk to Balance Agility," and it's going to be linked to Barry Beam out at USC. But again, it was a collaboration. A lot of you probably recognize Barry's name for all his cost model work over decades. But this very short paper shows there's a graph in it and a simple table, and it quantifies what, again, we all kind of know inside, which is, if I don't spend much time architecting, right, on the front side, I'm going to pay, and in their table, you'll see in rework, so you may call it defect density or fixing problems, right, in rework required, and schedule slip, right? And the larger the program is, the worse those two problems take the hit, right? Those two areas take the hit. So, so James, that's one aspect. The other aspect of what you talk about is the team, just getting up to speed and such, especially if they're not familiar with, let me call it modern day architecting, right? So you need to spend some time with these people. First, just letting them understand that some of this, not all of this, but some of this is just terminology and language, right? They'll say, oh, okay, I used to build that model or these models, but I call them this, and this architecture standard calls them that, right? Or these approaches. Oh, okay, well, I've been doing that for 10 or 15 years in my system engineering role or my software engineering role. So again, just getting past the semantics is a simple but necessary thing to do. And then there are new things to be learned, right, in this practice of formalized architecting. So then you just have to start the orientation sessions, and everybody on both sides, if you will, the instructor side and the learner side, just need to be patient. I mean, it's not going to come in a week or anything, but you can provide them bite-sized chunks, right, which will help them move forward. And ideally, put somebody on their engagement who can lead the charge, right? And then everybody can just learn from that person who already has the architecting expertise.
Okay, great. So we have another audience question from Jim. He's wondering if you could say a little bit more about the difference between system, enterprise, and software architecture. And what I would tack on is essentially, how different is the practice of architecting, if you will, across those scopes?
So great question. And clearly, you know from my talk that we in my company have leveraged a lot by unifying or looking across all three of those realms. So the simplest way I typically, because we get that question a lot, the simplest way I typically answer that is in the models that person would create. Okay, so that role, software architect. Typically, of course, those segmented models are the software, right, packaged within the system, interfaces between those software modules and such being defined. While the system level architect, it's at a higher level, right, across it. So the software is within it, but the software may be a chunk coexisting with commoditized hardware procured from, just a vendor, right, a computing platform vendor. But that also might be unified with specific physical products that your company has produced. So in our case, maybe that's sensors, right? Also segmented in there are the people side, the operations, if you will, of all these things, because not everything's done by software or by hardware. There are elements along the workflow of whatever the system's designed to do. So those two, there's certainly much more overlap, or I'll say synergy. But again, broadly speaking, the software people would have the software specific segmentations. They'd have the data models, probably conceptual, logical, the physical schema. They would have services models, not necessarily, but if they're software services, they would. The system engineers would argue, of course, not all services are software. That's a true statement. But again, I think looking at the models helps segment, okay, what's the software space versus the system space. When you get into enterprise architecture, it gets more unique. Okay, those types of models, if you go online and look at some of those samples from, in particular, if you go to government sites, because some organizations tend to have theirs out in the public domain. Most companies will not do that. But if you look at some government examples, you'll see that really there is no interconnection typically. So if I pick a government, let's talk about NOAA, okay, the weather people, right? So if I pick that administration of the US government and you're looking at their enterprise architecture models, it's really more about their portfolio of systems they have procured over time. I'm not going to see the communications network diagrams of those specific systems or systems of systems within their EA. I might see the different types of platforms, hardware platforms, software platforms that span their portfolio of dozens, hundreds of systems they've procured over time. I might see metadata about the locations, and now that puts us for NOAA in the tens of thousands of system instantiations, because they procure a system and then they might move it to different places around the world to measure environmental parameters or detect phenomenology right in that portion of the planet. So it's, again, just a different look of the models. But at a high level, architecture is about taking a problem, breaking it into chunks, and setting up interfaces between those chunks, right? Civil architecture, software system, enterprise, maybe less so, because again, a lot of emphasis on portfolio management, but you're still partitioning things, so typically across your organization in EA. So because there's so much of that base thinking, that replicates, James, across those different realms. And again, we found it very simple to take something from one of those arenas, like the software architecture space, and migrate it to our system architects. And yeah, there's some terminology changes, but once you understand, okay, every time I see this word, I mentally replace it with that word. You know, now I'm not distracted by the language. I can worry about the concept and the construct and use that in whatever architecture space I happen to be in. So great question. Hopefully, again, the focus on the models helps get you oriented as to how you can go look at representations and get a better understanding of the distinction between those areas. But I will say, from a technique perspective, there's a lot of Venn diagram overlap in those areas, right? Where you can draw the lines tends to be in the model sets.
All right. So for those who are listening today who are interested in furthering their own careers as architects, what advice would you share with them?
Great question. So there are three things that, for most young engineers, right? So architects or otherwise, right? If they want to get better in their area, I tend to always point out these three things, right? Number one is read. And I know not everybody's a reader, but your career will be well served if you become one, if you're not already a voracious reader. Okay, and that is, well, in the software architecture space, clearly the SEI series of texts is, I mean, that's seminal work there, right? But you don't stop there, regardless of how many 100 pages that would be. You might know, James, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds of pages that would be, right? But across those texts, that's really important. Online for free, right? You need to find the key architecture standards in your software or system or enterprise architecture space. You'll start with your wheelhouse, right? Which is going to be software architecture for this audience. But I would just make my plea that you spend at least a little bit of time looking in those other areas, because again, we've seen over 2 decades, there is information that will help you architect, right? And you don't want to miss out on it because, for example, the System Architecture Forum published papers, and they have, that are out there in the public domain over many, many years, almost 20 years now, but you never looked at them because of the name of their org, right? You thought, well, that's the System Forum and I'm a software architect, right? You need to, again, kind of blast through the label and look one level deeper and then decide, okay, this fits, or if it doesn't, move on. So again, reading, James, clearly really, really important to me. The SEI has a lot of free technical reports. You don't just have to go buy textbooks, right? You can download their reports. you need to practice, right, for anything. And I understand, of course, starting out in your career, if you're early as an architect or not even architecting yet, how do you make that happen? Well, maybe you cannot make that happen inside your organization. So you look towards maybe some certificate programs, and perhaps your company or your org might pay for you to go into these programs. So it's going to be less time consuming than going to get a degree an advanced degree in architecture. But the SEI has their software program, which is 3 classes and then an exam at the end, which will give you a foundation and exercises along the way, right, while you're doing the coursework. And at least those exercises begin to let you get your fingers a little bit dirty, right, performing some and generating some architecture models, performing some of the architecting tasks. MIT also has a system architecture program, so you can take a look at that. And other universities, I'm sure, have other certificate programs. So read, practice, and then give back. It's really, really important. And you will find as you give back or contribute to the evolution of the architecture discipline, even though it seems like I'm saying that's just you sharing something, you will learn while you are sharing. It's much like giving a presentation, right? You'll learn things just from interactions like this with your audience that'll hopefully make you a little bit smarter about your topic. So by giving back, there are many ways to do that. One thing that comes immediately to mind is reviewing standards when there's a call out for feedback on a architecture standard. So that'll force you to read, right? You'll have to go through the standard. You mark some things that strike you. You provide feedback. Their reconciliation team takes that along with feedback from many other people. And the next release comes out and you've helped contribute to the betterment of the practice. You know, if that's not something you like, then maybe it's just once you learn a little more about architecture, maybe you speak at a local university or a local high school, right? Just letting the engineering students, the STEM students, have a sense of what this practice is, right? They're going to know about software engineering. They might know about system engineering, but especially at the high school level, it's unlikely that they've been even lightly acquainted with the architecture practice yet. So variety of ways you can give back, but you know, drop me an email if you want some more fodder. I've got plenty of recommendations there.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Rolf. I really appreciate those insights, and that's really good advice that I would echo for anyone who's listening. Unfortunately, we are at time, so I'm going to have to call this a day and just say once again, Rolf, congratulations. You are more than deserving of this year's Linda M. Northrop Software Architecture Award. Congratulations.
Thanks, James, and to everyone.